So just an awful thing in Iran this last couple days. On Tuesday morning at dawn, Abolfazl Sepahi and Amirhossein Safari, they were two individuals who were arrested during the nationwide protests that took place in Iran, were executed. They were involved in the protests that were against the regime during the January 8th and 9th kind of chaos that ensued in the country. We're still at this point, 6 months later, still trying to figure out exactly what happened in those protests, who used what kind of violence against whom. But in any case, the regime, which is sort of addicted to the death penalty, publicly executed these two gentlemen, Abolfazl Sepahi and Amirhossein Safari. And there were protests in the streets of Isfahan as these two were executed publicly in Ali Khani Square, Maidan Ali Khani in Isfahan. They were sentenced to death in on charges that I don't think are like that legitimate. I'll talk about that just in a minute. I'm Borzu Deragahi. This is my podcast. It's called Badlands. You can subscribe at borzu.substack.com. I'm also on Apple Podcasts, on YouTube, and on Spotify. Excuse the informal appearance here. I'm actually traveling. I have a flight delay. I'm in Chicago heading to the East Coast for just a brief visit. And, I just started to live it up a little, relax a little bit and dress up in a sort of summer way. It's been a hectic couple days. There were storms in Chicago that took out the power. It's been a very irregular time in terms of people who are addicted to being connected. I've been up on so much news lately as I'm dealing with these power outages at my family's place in Chicago. And now those storms apparently are moving east and messing with the flights that are heading towards the East Coast. So I'm a little bit informal, a little bit out of sorts here today for the normal podcast. And then yesterday, I didn't even do a podcast. Instead, I published an article from a story that I had written about Iran's South. If you get a chance, check it out. It's about what is happening in the South and how the war this time around, this phase of the war, is affecting Iran's South disproportionately compared to other parts of the country, and how that might have an impact just more generally on the country. So on to this case of this death penalty. Details are scant. There is a great organization. I call it a great organization, at least. Some people criticize me, apparently get some U.S. funding, but you know what? I don't even care, because they do good work, and they have been really good on the casualties that are being inflicted by the U.S. as well as in the first phase of the war. They were excellent on documenting the casualties and civilian deaths as well as military deaths of those that were in the line of fire of the Israeli and U.S. bombs. So I trust them, and I consider them credible. And they have a report about this. Let me just go through it with people here. And it's from the Human Rights Activist News Agency. And according to the Harana, the bodies of those executed at this point on Tuesday morning, early Tuesday morning, were not even handed back to their families yet. The families of the defendants in the case were gathered outside a prison where they were executed and being held, and they were basically protesting, and there was protests, and there was videos of protests that were emerging from the country. The internet is pretty much available in the country right now. It hasn't been blocked. So I think that is a significant factor in the fact that we're getting these details and we're getting these videos. And I also think that it shows a certain level of confidence on the part of the regime, on the part of the government, that they're not blocking internet anymore. They realize that it was more trouble than it's worth, and that they feel confident and legitimate enough that they don't need to block communications coming in and out of the country. Now, listen to these charges against these two young men who were hung early Tuesday morning. They were basically charged with membership in rebel groups acting against national security. So what were the rebel groups? We don't know. There's no details there. I mean, that seems like a charge from the early years of the revolution when you had these armed militant groups. Were they armed, or were they just members of a rebel group? That sounds like BS to me. And then there's the classic charge, muharebe, enmity against God, waging war against God. This is a crime under Islamic jurisprudence. Another one, spreading corruption on earth, whatever that means. Destruction and arson of public property. And that's like the only charge they have against these guys that seems somewhat potentially legitimate and concrete, that could be proven in a court of law and so on. And it sounds like something that you get like a fine for. Arson, perhaps, of public property, maybe you get 1 or 2 years in prison, but death, it just seems extreme. And it just shows that the regime is really hooked on the death penalty. There's been an acceleration of the use of the death penalty in Iran. I personally am opposed to the death penalty. I think it's abominable. And I think it's terrible when the Americans do it. Saudi Arabia uses the capital punishment a lot. And I think it's horrible, for example, that Israel has resurrected capital punishment, but designed the law to target only alleged Palestinian acts of terrorism. So I think that is abhorrent as well. But it's also horrible and condemnable when Iran does it. According to the Human Rights Activist Network, the case has been reviewed by the Supreme Court, which upheld the sentences. The executions were carried out following the completion of legal procedures. Now, according to Iranian law, death penalty cases are just automatically reviewed and held and scrutinized by the Supreme Court. So that's supposed to be a measure of protection, because these guys, these suspects in these politically charged cases, they don't go to normal district court or regular court. They go to the revolutionary courts, which are a lot more opaque and a lot more just dirty than the other courts. Like the defendants don't have access to the lawyers are harassed, case documents are not handed over, everything is like national security. And it gives you like a little idea of what could happen in other Western countries in case these national security criteria are used in enforcing criminal cases and so on. According to Harana, the judicial proceedings, as usual, were marked by significant irregularities. The defense lawyer had lack of an access to the case file. That's pretty typical. I've done a lot of these reports about these cases in the past. The court hearings were conducted by video conference, with the families denied information about the contents of the verdict. This is just horrible. And the court failed to even consider the defense's evidence and arguments. That's what Harana is saying. And it's just, there's a very long record of just malpractice in Iranian courts. And this is why, because of this, that we should definitely be against the death penalty being used in this context of these politically charged cases, especially when you have one segment of the population, the hardliners, that are basically screaming for blood. They want these death penalties. These death penalties, I think they're not really meant to intimidate people, because that's not how you calculate whether you're going to take part in a protest or not. I think they're just basically offering fresh meat and throwing meat and blood to their supporters, saying, here's some victims for your anger and your resentment. We took these guys and we hung them in public and dawn. And that's, I think, just terrible. There are also in Iran just a lot of cases where people are forced to confess. There are cases, yes, absolutely. Well, they'll say, look, if you don't confess to this crime, we'll do something to your sister or your family, and your family will pay for it. There are also cases where they're like, look, just confess and you'll be out of here in a few months. They'll just lie to the defendant. I think American cops do that sometimes too, to get a confession. But I think it's just still terrible. And there's also allegations of torture and other kinds of poor treatment in these security-related cases. A lot of the times, the torture is psychological. They'll hold the person incommunicado in a prison cell with the lights on 24 hours a day until the guy starts going bananas and says, hey, what do I have to do to get out of this case? What do I have to do to get out of this hell? And what the prosecutors will say is just confess, just sign this document. And then they use that against the person. And in this particular case, they're using them to put them to death. In any case, this is, not the first time that there's been an irregular, unacceptable execution in Iran. It won't be the last. This is just a terrible, terrible mark and stigma on the Islamic Republic and of Iran. And it's one of the reasons why human rights activists are so concerned about what happens in Iran. No, it's not just some psychological operation. There are genuinely horrible things that the Iranian regime does. And these death penalties in this case against people who were possibly just peacefully protesting. Maybe they were violently protesting. Maybe they were members of an outlawed group. But did they do anything? Did they kill somebody? What is the criteria for capital punishment in this country? Okay, if you rape a child or person or something like that and you murder someone, okay, those are legitimate grounds, I think, for international standards for capital punishment if you insist on including capital punishment in your repertoire of punishments and in your criminal justice system. But this kind of flimsy case, it just does a disservice to Iran, to Iranians, to jurisprudence in general, to law and order, and to criminal justice in general. And it's just unjust and not right. So anyway, this is going to be a little shortened week. I'm not sure what I can get done because I'll be traveling over the coming days. But I did do a couple interviews in recent days. One with India's SEN, Southern Era Network television, where I break down Donald Trump's proposed nuclear deal with Saudi Arabia. And I also discuss major diplomatic shifts taking place in the Middle East. And in an interview with India's NewsX World, I discuss the latest in a series of Donald Trump threats against Iran and whether there is a prospect for a return to the Memorandum of Understanding or any kind of deal. Just listen in and watch.
This particular headline that just came out, the nuclear deal has obviously been signed, but just now when we look at it, a lot of people, when they hear that a nuclear deal has been signed, their mind suddenly shifts to, is it nuclear weapons? So how should people understand what has been agreed so far and why has it happened now?
I mean, first of all, we're talking about a deal that is preceded by a 2-year study. That will be a study about whether or not the United States should help the Saudi government achieve nuclear enrichment capability on its soil. And that will probably be subject at some point to congressional approval in the United States. Congress is extraordinarily fickle on such matters. And we're also talking about enrichment of uranium. That is very different than a nuclear weapon. We're talking about the ability to take uranium, raw uranium, and enrich it to the percentage necessary for a reactor, a nuclear reactor that produces energy, and that's less than 5%. For a full-scale nuclear weapon, that requires 90% or higher levels of enrichment, which is not anywhere near what this deal would allow. And then even for like a dirty bomb or some crude nuclear device, that would require 80% or higher to make that possible.
And that brings in the Abraham Accords, because that suddenly becomes, and with this particular tweet, it just puts this as the most contentious issue, Borzu. If Saudi is to sort of sign and join these Abraham Accords, would that sort of fundamentally change the regional balance of power, do you think?
I think it might. It's not clear what it would mean for it to sign the Abraham Accords. Look, I think it's very unlikely that Saudi Arabia would sign the Abraham Accords as long as Benjamin Netanyahu is prime minister of Israel, as long as this ethnic cleansing, this mass ethnic cleansing is taking place in West Bank and Gaza, this violence that is considered pretty much completely unacceptable throughout the Muslim world and the Arab world. It would undermine Saudi Arabia's position worldwide. You know what? And not even just with the Arab and Muslim worlds. I think at this point it would undermine the Saudi position even in the West. That's how unpopular Israel has become. So it's not really a time to sign a peace with Israel, but that could change if Benjamin Netanyahu is voted out of office, if he's prosecuted maybe for his corruption instead of his violence. That's more feasible to the Israelis. If there's some kind of political change with regard to the Palestinians, perhaps that's what the Saudi leadership is banking on, and that's why they agreed.
US has been a security provider, one of the primary ones, shall we say. But after the recent conflict with Iran, has US's role changed? Because I understand when you mention, how Donald Trump and what his decisions are, but at a system level in the United States, do they view that the security strategy is changing in amongst these Gulf countries?
Well, I think there's different views in the analyst and political community as to whether it's changing, but I think that there's definitely change, and that change preceded the conflict. It preceded even to some extent the Qatar attack by Israel. It went back years as the Gulf states and other regional players began to realize that the U.S. was somewhat retreating from the Middle East, was eager to pivot to Asia, so to speak. I think that, for example, when China brokered that arrangement, the peace arrangement, the diplomatic arrangement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, that was a major milestone as well, showing China as a major player in the region. And then this war has accelerated that process. The view on the part of the Gulf states and the regional powers as well that the U.S. is just not a reliable partner, and is not a reliable security partner. It is a fickle, a dramatic, kind of unstable character in this whole drama, so to speak. And that's why we had, for example, the emergence of what's called the R4, the regional four powers, that includes Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Turkey, as a kind of diplomatic quartet that has been leading the peace efforts. That includes Qatar as well, leading the peace efforts between U.S. and Iran. These regional countries are stepping up. These middle powers are stepping up because they see a vacuum and a sense of maybe perhaps even despair at the way that the U.S. has been behaving.
And there's also a concept of middle powers, of Pakistan and Turkey that you're mentioning. But Bozu, I'll come to you because India has also, signed a mutual defense deal with the United Arab Emirates. So how do you look at these middle powers, like Turkey, like Pakistan, and this regional evolving order? How do they sort of fit in, and how do they see this deal with the Saudi and the US?
Well, I think that the India deal is kind of aligning India with the United Arab Emirates and Israel and Greece and Cyprus. That is a kind of alternative to the Q4, and also an alternative to the Iranian Hezbollah Houthi axis, just another axis emerging in the region that goes across to Asia, all of it in counterbalance perhaps to China a little bit, or at least in cooperation with China in the case of Pakistan and Saudi Arabia and Turkey. So I think that's how it's viewed. And perhaps I think maybe India should think twice about joining this alliance with Israel and the United Arab Emirates. But it perhaps doesn't even have a choice. It sees how Pakistan has emerged in this equation, in this new reality, and it needs to kind of come up with its own alliance, because this, as the other analyst was pointing out, this Pakistan, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Egypt emerging alliance is going to be really powerful if it gets its act together, if it becomes more defined. That is a really powerful proposition. It is one that is based on mutual interests rather than ideology. It is potentially a counterbalance to other major forces in the region and in Eurasia as well.
Just last question, Wozu, and then we'll end. You mentioned how unpopular this particular war of choice has been, even in the United States as well. What is it? Because we've now gone back to the escalatory ladder where both sides are exchanging missiles. How costly has this war been? We have still been able to analyze those costs, or how costly it has been?
I think definitely the latter. I think you can't measure the costs of this conflict purely in currency terms, purely in terms of the costs of the expenditures and the damages. I think there will be knock-on effects. I think it will have a global impact. This is going to be much worse in a way than the Iraq war, even though that lasted much longer. It's going to be much more impactful than the Vietnam War, because you're dealing with really the heart of the energy situation on the planet and the heart of the global supply chains and the basic root of the global economy, and you're messing with it. But some of it will be bad. People are going to lose their jobs. They're going to lose their savings. Inflation and costs are going to go up. And that's going to be like, you can't measure that purely in terms of the dollars that are being spent by the U.S. and Iran in terms of damage and munitions. And here is that interview with India's NewsX World.
Now, Trump has said in this interview that Washington is fully prepared to resume military action. We've seen this pause over the weekend after 2 weeks of consecutive strikes. What does this indicate to you about the current American military strategy?
I don't think that his comments mean much. I think that no one takes him seriously at this point anymore. He's been saying this on and off for months now, and we're now entering the 6th month of this conflict that was supposed to originally last just a few days and then just a few weeks. And now we're about to enter month 6. So I don't think anyone takes his remarks and his threats seriously at this point. I think that what's more important is, as you mentioned, the interceptor stockpile, as well as Iran's continued resilience, its continued ability to strike at U.S. targets, U.S. bases, improvised U.S. bases, including the one far away in Jordan, in which 3 American soldiers were killed just days ago. So I think that that is really what's concerning. U.S. military generals have been warning Donald Trump that there's not that many targets anymore left, unless they want to start hitting civilian targets. And that carries its own weight and price tag, which includes potential attacks on Gulf energy infrastructure that would devastate the world's economy.
Trump has also said that the United States is currently engaged in talks with Iran. Iran has also said similar statements. Now, are we seeing perhaps a return to the negotiating table? Do you think that these talks might continue in earnest despite the last 2 weeks of strikes? It looked at one stage that the MOU was signed. Some people were quite optimistic about the situation. What's your take?
Well, I think I'm pretty pessimistic. I don't think the negotiations are going to lead anywhere. I think that the Americans are using the negotiations as a kind of stock manipulation, market manipulation. They realize that in the absence of any negotiations, oil prices just shoot up dramatically and equities markets shoot down. And the Iranians are using negotiations so that they're the good, hey, we're the good guys, we're engaged in diplomacy and so on. Just how little trust there is in the American word. The Saudis signed a deal with the Americans just recently about the enrichment and allowing nuclear technology in Saudi Arabia. And literally a day later, after Trump was criticized by neoconservatives in Washington and the Israel lobby, he reneged on the deal and added all these other conditions. So the Iranians are looking at this and saying, if Donald Trump is betraying his friends and allies like this, imagine what he'll do to us. So I don't think there's any trust there for any deal, although both sides are going through the motions for their own reason.
How do you think the upcoming elections might be playing a role in some of the rhetoric that we're seeing come out of the States?
I'm not sure if Donald Trump cares anymore about the elections.
Mm-hmm.
I think his strategy for the elections is to try to cheat. And that's why he has this SAVE Act, this attempt to take control of voting in the United States, which is usually left up to the states and counties, take it federal in violation of the U.S. Constitution that basically requires states to organize elections, is very clear on that. I think that's more his strategy for the elections than the idea of using any kind of victory in the Iran war for advantage in the elections. I think he's somewhat given up on the elections. Hey, thank you so much for watching. I hope the technical difficulties didn't turn you off too much. I'm Borzu Dergahi. This is Badlands. You can subscribe at borzu.substack.com. Also, I'm available on Apple Podcasts, on YouTube, and on Spotify.